We're live!
Welcome everyone to Semifinals 2 of UiTM IV. Massive congratulations to all of you. In opening government, we have the NSK Strikes Back. In opening opposition, we have UTMara A. In closing government, we have IIUM C. Opposition, we have Mahirah B. Alright, since we have quite an audience today, super basic house rules, twofold. First, please ensure your phones are all silent, if not switched off. Don't do extreme loud, just silent it. And of course, try your best not to exit or enter the room during speeches. And if you really must exit or enter, do so in between speeches. Paneling alongside me will be Ashley. Standing alongside me will be Ashley, Kavindra, Patrick, and Fatin. Without further ado, on the motion, this House believes that the culture of naming and shaming of microaggressions is more harm than good. I call upon the Prime Minister to propose.
So as a minority, I would know a thing or two about microaggressions. I'll be subjected to microaggressions, and maybe more marginally so than the average person. But I'm also possibly equally guilty of doing the same, of exerting microaggressions on other individuals. It may not be actively done with an intention to cause hurt. Maybe it's done subconsciously, and maybe there's a lot of privilege attached to it. But then, at the end of the day, how do we then police this discourse? So what must be done in the debate? So from opening government, we will prove to you that naming and shaming is an extremely specific, narrow way to tackling individual and specific interaction. Sure, but it does not address the larger culture of disrespect and the perception that communities have in society. So what exactly is the culture of microaggression? We posit to you that it is about making specific targeted statements, either knowingly or unknowingly. So for example, things such as you speak well for an Indian, or I'm surprised that you made it to a semi-finals of predominantly Malaysian tournament. We think these kind of statements are often only applicable to that particular individual, primarily because you are making an active judgment of their identity based on that singular level of interaction that you have with that person. So we say, if you're another Singaporean like Reuben, for example, right, you may not blink twice when you see him in the semi-finals or finals, because the expectation that him making it is there. So why then does this naming and shaming not help these kind of interactions? We say that number one, right, telling someone of their specific instances of their microaggression doesn't really change their viewpoint. Sure, they may have different interactions to that person in the future. Maybe if you tell someone, or maybe saying a specific statement is bad, maybe you may treat that person differently, but it doesn't affect your perception of the individual in the way you treat that particular community as a whole, or you treat how other people are as well. So at the end of the day, you only change your interaction with that one specific person because maybe you go called out on that one specific interaction, but you don't really think you have a general problem with the rest of society because you believe that only that one person is particularly offended by what you say. Secondly, we think this is also because you are also well aware of the problem and you are also part of the problem. This is where I talk about the moral arc of humanity. We think we are inherently biased human beings who are often may not be actively cognizant of our privileges and perceived interaction, because we think that these kind of things are developed over your years of the environment that you grew up in, the group of friends that you have, etc., etc. So it's not enough for opposition, for example, to simply say that they know exactly the amount of hurt that they're causing to the individual, because say offense is an extremely subjective thing and we think that it exists on a particular spectrum, right? So we don't really think that policing your singular interaction with one individual necessarily changes the entire culture and the entire opinion that you have of a particular community, because those things are crafted with the years of environment that you have been and the years of interaction that you have with other individuals. So in fact, we think that it causes a disincentive, right? It causes a lot of harms, and this is where I talk to you, engage directly with the debate. Before that, yes.
So do you stand for calling out microaggressions, and in what manner will you call out that microaggression?
So we don't think naming and shaming is necessarily something that needs to be done. We think instead you can have broader discussions of what perception is, what privilege exactly means, and those kind of things. We don't think those kind of things are harder to change than your individual microaggressions with another person. So how exactly is this harm exacted? Number one, we think that those kind of individuals who are committing these microaggressions get more turned off because anything they say can be construed or viewed as a direct attack on the other person's identity, right? So for example, like quarterfinals, right? Reuben ran a relatively good case on feminism in Playboy, yet he was named and shamed publicly for doing so and there was no level of interaction with him as well, right? Because they didn't want to engage with him as well. So there's a culture of active ad hominem attacks that results in the naming and shaming of microaggressions, where you think your version of offense is the only one out there. But we think that like individuals within societies have a spectrum of offense, right? There are different things that different people view as particularly offensive. But when you think that your perception of offense is the only one that should exist and the only one that should be necessarily legitimized, this leads to a refusal to engage the other party and maybe like talk to them and think about why they are specifically making those microaggressions. Instead, you actively assume that they are actively out to hurt you when they make specific statements about you as an individual. And we think this is often goes beyond the other party just telling the individual that you shouldn't say this because like this is particularly bad, but not explaining why those things are particularly bad or how those things like relate with the like rest of the perceptions that you have in society. So like a person who has committed offense may think that, oh, I've only committed offense towards this person, haven't really committed offense towards the particular community at large, or there isn't something that I need to do about the interaction that I have with other individuals within those communities. No, thank you. Second harm, it also leads to an individual level of response that merely reinforces your privilege. So what do I mean by this? When it is assumed that every word you say is aggressive, or that you are actively always aware of your words on other people, it becomes a high barrier to police what is objectively bad behaviors. No, thank you. So, for example, right, if I accidentally call an Indian man at a restaurant and assume him to be a waiter, right, like we think I may not have said it expressly to cause particular hurt to that person or make a judgment based on his identity. But once it's misconstrued as such, right, and misconstrued that like he is like that for example, I only said those things because I actively wanted to hurt his identity as an Indian man, we think any such further interaction by myself is seen as less valuable because the people think that every other word that I say from now on is inherently less valuable because it will always be offensive to me. So we think there's no objectivity in the kind of discourse that you have with these other individuals because there's always the preconceived notion that the words that they use and the lyrical expression that they have directly represent the entire identity of that particular individual. So we think they are harmed a lot more in that discourse when like you are not even able to actively engage the people who you think take offense to what you say. So what then is the better way to do this? We think this is through like active discourse in schools about like the perception of offense, like accepting like the broader ideas, right? Instead of just calling out specific microaggressions. So what do I mean by this? So things such as like calling out like things such as like racism, for example, why those things are particularly bad. Instead of just having like individual interaction, oh, you shouldn't assume that I'm dumb simply because like I am smart. Like we don't really think it works that way. Rather the discourse needs to be about what exactly is racism in society. How do we make sure that we police our behavior that affects everyone else, not just one particular person, right? Because we think that person's right to offense is not marginally higher than your right to offend that person knowingly or unknowingly. So we think there needs to be a distinguishing metric that governments and people can ascertain, right? And this is where like things such as like, for example, anti-Semitic laws are objectively bad because you recognize that the lives of some Jews are affected by the way they were treated. Those things are like aggressively promoting hate speech, ethnic cleansing, and like extermination of a race. Once you police individual levels of discourse, right, like everything is seen as offensive, it lowers the threshold for what is perceived to be an offense. At the end of the day, if your opponent somehow offends you, right, don't disengage with the veil of equity because you don't know if it was active hurt. Talk to them after the debate about it instead of just judging them based on their identity or not even willing to take their POIs. Then maybe we can go back to the old style of debating, right? Like therefore, we think we should go with opening government.
House thanks Prime Minister and now invites the Leader of Opposition to oppose. Yeah.
The culture of acknowledgement and broad discourse that opening government wants in this debate is contingent on individuals in status quo acknowledging and coming to terms with the act of microaggression to begin with. If you believe the characterization of Prime Minister, the fact that you do it unconsciously, the fact that it's difficult to detect, we think it makes it far worse if you don't call out individuals and identify that the language of communication that you're using is an act of microaggression. Because let's note that microaggression often targets communities that are least empowered and least privileged in status quo. So it's not enough to say that we can just not police individuals overtly, we think you also have to account for the fact that microaggressions are specifically targeting communities and not just your daily interaction. Because we will posit from opening opposition that microaggression belies all the protection that opening government says. So even though you have discriminatory laws or anti-Semitic laws, the nature of microaggression is that it's insidious in nature, ladies and gentlemen. It's hard to detect. So even in a world where you have things like affirmative action or anti-sexist laws, we don't think that accounts for the daily interaction that individuals have with each other. Secondly, we don't have to assume hurt exclusively on opening opposition. We can also account for lack of information and ignorance on the part of individuals, because sometimes, and I don't think it's hard to prove, that people are so entrenched in their privileged ideals that I think it's okay for them to make casual remarks with a deflection of humor and say, hey bro, I'm just kidding around, doesn't really mean anything, right? Opening government thinks it's bad that people will always have to constantly self-check themselves, but we want that. We want the people to be wary about the language that they're using and what they are saying, especially for least privileged communities. Lastly, will people be overtly scrutinized? Perhaps they will, but we think it kickstarts a discourse about what sort of communication is acceptable in status quo, what sort of language you use when you interact with each other, what sort of commonplace ideals do you think it's good in order to interact, especially when it comes to static characterizations of identities that individuals may have. No thank you, sir. No thank you, ma'am. Sorry. So firstly, who commits microaggression? We think often it is individuals from privileged positions who either don't understand or who attempt to placate individuals in the lack of privilege in their identities. But two, we also think these are people from oppressed communities who are entrenched in the ideals that perhaps conversations revolving around your identity and tied and convoluted with humor is an acceptable and commonplace language for people to engage with. That's why everyone does it to each other irrespective. No, thank you. Why is microaggression bad? Visibly creating awareness. One, because we say it's incredibly hard to detect to begin with, right? So we don't know whether catcalling or calling someone beautiful could be a microaggression when they're walking down the street, or asking a person, why don't you wear makeup? Perhaps you will look better, could be a microaggression, right? Or calling Asians yellow, or like meeting an engineering student and asking them, you have Indian parents, don't you? But secondly, we don't think it's singular in nature as well. We think you face it on a daily basis from individual interaction, but it also seeps into pop culture. I'll talk about this a lot more later. But we will contest from opening opposition that awareness is a lot harder when you don't call people out to acknowledge. So why was the culture of calling out good and important? What does naming and shaming do? One is that individuals who feel entitled to these opinions and can premise their opinion on the guise of ignorance don't understand or don't think to the impact of that discussion, because often when it comes to microaggressive statements, individuals who are at the end of receiving that statement often feel like, why is that their identity is currently being attacked? Why is it that individuals can take my identity, one that's inherently mine, and turn it into a humorous thing, or turn it into a conversational language without people ever acknowledging perhaps my racial identity or my sexist identity shouldn't be attacked or shouldn't be like subjugated to a standard of humor in order for people to be able to relate to those rights. What we would say is that naming and shaming forces individuals who commit microaggressions to be able to defend that position rather than just saying, let's have broad discussion without illustrating what those broad discussions are. It is harder for them to defend themselves in a world where they say, well, we'll have conversations one day. We have legislation like anti-hate speech, but hate speech is very easy to discern versus microaggression, right? What does naming and shaming do? One, it allows for people to be able to coalesce behind a particular method that identifies there is an insidious form of discrimination. Because the way in which people who are privileged view discrimination is that often once we placate them with legislation, or if we do a little bit, it's enough to placate individuals who are currently aggressed upon. But we don't think that's sufficient, given that people often have to account for that discrimination often targets you on a daily basis, and perhaps a mere legislation is insufficient. Secondly, on disempowered community, ladies and gentlemen, often we are talking about the Asian kid in America who people ask him questions like, shouldn't you be good at math because you're from China? Things like that. Tell these groups of individuals that are people behind you in society that acknowledge perhaps you are from a position of less privilege based on social construct, and that becomes a statement of solidarity for these individuals, ladies and gentlemen. But we think it goes far beyond conversation, because we think past the point of it seeping into daily life that perhaps we may have things like legislation, but microaggression is often left out of that because it's hard to detect and hard to identify, right? So what happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that people find it very difficult to distinguish or discern at what point do we attack people, or what point do people feel safe to partake in that discussion. So what does naming and shaming do is that it changes how people react. And we think it's better, A, because it provides a more amiable environment for people to interact in. But before I move on to why we create changes in structural levels, I'll take closing.
In order for your benefits to accrue, you have to aggressively name and shame people before judging their intentions. Why do we have to defend the world by returning a blind eye? Why can't we have one-on-one conversations?
No, I don't understand. We can judge intent. We don't have to judge intent, because I told you the intent doesn't matter as long as the act is carried out, right? So changes in structural level is an interaction at your workplaces. So if when you go to work and how your colleagues interact with you, or when you go to parliament to build laws and often like female lawmakers are ignored in their grievances, for example, all of these things are going to be things that we self-check and self-believe in order to ensure that people have an amiable environment for them to participate in. But lastly, on pop culture, we think that pop culture often relies on popular narratives that society likes, and it often popularizes insulting jokes to individuals, and this often stems from things like microaggression, ladies and gentlemen. So in a TV show like Glee, that is apparently celebrated for diversification, there were many microaggressions that was created in that TV show. For example, the two Asians had to get together, and anytime they got a B, it's an Asian F, and things like that, right? Or the Jewish girl had to go for plastic surgery in order for her to feel good about herself. These are things that are often expounded in things like pop culture, and it goes back to how communities talk to each other as well. And we think it becomes a cyclical issue. At this point, the amorphous, vague standard that government wants to operate in this debate is insufficient. Very proud to
House Leader of Opposition, and now invites the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, yeah. Mr. Speaker, it's disgusting that Jay, who comes from a majority privileged community, can claim to know more about microaggressions and how it was solved. That wasn't particularly persuasive, right? Because she did raise arguments. And naming and shaming her or branding her as majority and therefore not understanding her position just doesn't work, because she did have valid points. So let's first talk about the difference in semantics, right? Because she wants to talk about calling out and the need for calling out. Like, look, we've got no problem with calling out. We have a problem with naming and shaming. And let me explain the difference between the two. Calling out refers to saying, hey, you did something wrong, that made me feel bad, right? I'm calling out your mistake. You did a mistake. Naming and shaming implies a level of antagonism, implies a level of aggression that's required, implies a level of trying to embarrass the guy or trying to put him on a pedestal and say what you did is shameful, is wrong, and unfortunately you need to defend that, right? Like, ask Mimsal for feedback how, because the motion is slightly clearly phrased. I'm sorry. Microaggression. So the premise of her argument is this, right? That naming and shaming is inherently good because it allows for greater discourse. Because somehow this individual can now defend themselves. Our objection is this: the manner in which they are able to defend themselves, something I'll illustrate later in my extension, will be problematic when you are antagonistic to them. They will revert to very simplistic rebuttals, like, wait, I'm not racist, right? I'm not like these other guys that lynch people. Because, like, I got minority friends. I screw minority girls. I like minorities, right? And that just doesn't do anything to resolve the root cause of microaggressions. We can identify that it's an insidious form of aggression when we can pinpoint these mistakes and say, look, what you did is wrong, but explain why he did why it is wrong, right? Like calling out Shafiq for making the comparison with you and Albert because you are Indian and you have crazy hair. Or man, right? Like, that's just offensive, right? Because they are different people and with unique identities and they have value in and of itself. Okay? But before I go on, sure.
How will we get these guys to check their privilege without them even acknowledging perhaps they have privilege and can make certain
Because I can have a
comments?
conversation with them, because I make the assumption that they are rational people with the capacity to understand, right? I don't need to call them out here and say they are a disgusting human being for being racist. They're all Indian people look alike. Like, simple, right? Then they're more receptive to what I listen, and that's our objection in this debate. So let's look at the root cause of microaggressions, how a name and shame culture is counterintuitive, subverts discourse, and presents itself as overly antagonistic. Like, we need to first understand that in developed multicultural societies, they've moved on from race-based interaction in the social-political realm, right? Like maybe not Malaysia, particularly in post-racial conflict societies. The resolution of microaggressions is the final frontier in creating a safe space for all minorities. So we must accept that on some level, a degree of overt racism has been removed, right? Like, Indians aren't unfairly treated in Singapore by the police or government, but are subjected to more subtle forms of differentiation. What this means is that there's usually a general consensus that racism in and of itself is wrong. Why then do microaggressions exist? And this is where Subra nicely entered the debate, right? The answer is simple: ignorance. Majority cultures are unwilling to accept differences, yet subject the entirety of our personhood to those differences. Like the countless number of people who ask me about Indian food, or when I'm way more knowledgeable of char siu and the intricacies of char siu. Or like, they assume I speak Tamil when I'm in fact Malayali and I didn't even study Tamil in school, right? Or that because I'm Indian, I must be Hindu. It isn't that they want to offend me. They know that racism is wrong, but they inadvertently make me uncomfortable because of their ignorance. They are just being stupid. The problem then is naming and shaming these people does very little in educating majority cultures about the nuances of minorities group, because those nuances are extremely difficult to understand in the first place. That while Subra we might look similar, right? But he's a hardcore Brahmin, like does prayers for people, and my identity is a bit more ambiguous, right? Like I eat pork and eat all sorts of rubbish and do all sorts of unspeakable things. Like, if I were to call out each and every individual that was misinformed, I'm branding all of them as the same tool as racist, because that's what we do to racist people, right? Like, we call them out, we not just call them out, name and shame them and call them disgusting people, right? These individuals then are, hold on closely, are far less receptive to the education of those nuances because they are complex and they take time to understand. Like, is it enough that these individuals understand that they are wrong, which what naming and shaming does, but but screaming at them subverts the message and the discourse behind these nuances. The automatic reaction then for anyone is to go on the defensive, right? To say that, no, I'm not racist, I'm not like everyone else, like I have minority friends, and the defense becomes extremely simplistic in that sense, right? Because you need to counteract the overt antagonism in that particular case. But before I go on, last one for closing.
So fine, it's ignorance, but is it fine for the first interaction that you make with that person is a bit racist, sexist, or stereotypical remark?
Look, I didn't say microaggressions are wrong, are right? Like, there's just a difference in the way you can treat them and how you can educate these people. Like how I always take the time to explain that, no, not all Indians are the same. There are Tamils, there are Malayalis, even South Indians, people who are dark are like different. And I have a 5-minute conversation with them. I'm saying that's a better form of saying, of engaging with these people and educating them about my culture as opposed to branding them as racist. And that's the inherent, the implicit assumption when you become antagonistic, because that's the way we've treated racist people in the past. But let's look at the broader discussion of privilege, right? The combination of microaggressions and subtle differences in treatment, like with Malay privilege in Malaysia and Chinese privilege in Singapore. The catch-all phrase of check your privilege is intellectual laziness on the part of minorities. That you belong to the majority, you can never understand how I feel, right? Like, you should just shut up and listen to me. Like, don't talk about your own experiences. I don't give a damn. Like, that's just problematic, because ultimately, by virtue of you being Malay or Chinese, you too perpetuate this privilege, and you can never understand how I feel, right? Therefore, there is no part for you to engage in this conversation when that ignorance is perpetuated by the community as a whole, right? Especially when the existence of privilege in and of itself is in doubt. People don't even realize that privilege exists, Malay privilege or Chinese privilege exists. Therefore, there's a greater impetus for you to engage in that discussion, making sure that you establish the debate and ensure that you win it in the end. for minorities, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you. The House thanks the Deputy Prime Minister and now invites him to lead the opposition to the opening. Thank you. Yeah.
Woo! Sabah. Panel, we think side opening government largely ignore the type of people who are subject to microaggression. And these are usually the most disempowered people, for example, females, or for example, racial minority or religious minority. They refuse to acknowledge the lack of power for them to ever individually call out all those microaggressions, or whether or not they're ever capable of fighting those things on a one-on-one battle. The culture of naming and shaming this individual truly put the privilege and an ability to feel shame at their ignorance and ability to feel shame at their lack of ability to check their privilege. We think the lack of shame and lack of attributing of fault means that people can ride on ignorance to justify their microaggression, the same way opening government tried to do. We think that's highly ineffective. So what was their brilliant conclusion of this, right? Because what opening government said, or largely what they did, was firstly just justify that perhaps some people are ignorant because of their privilege and seems to think that's okay. But secondly, they say the brilliant way in which we deal with this is allowing people to openly confront those persons through a 5-minute conversation and things like that, right? Firstly, do you sincerely expect, like, if all the victims of microaggression to all directly confront their aggressors and that will be most effective? Or do you really think that is a manner in which allows them to truly check their privilege without the vast majority of people actually recognizing that that act was shameful and that act was something that's worth fault? So ability to check your privilege is a thing that doesn't happen because you need to pop that privilege bubble, right? And in order to do that, truly a strong message of shame and fault is needed for people to truly reconcile their privilege. We are all for the broader discussion being happening or going on, right? We think intellectual integrity are things that we have on our side as well. And if intellectual integrity on the way in which microaggression work is so good, then that means that that discussion can guide the way in which naming and shaming works. What do I mean? Reuben's naming and shaming of Jay was highly ineffective because we all know that doesn't make any sense. So it means that the culture of naming and shaming is also it's also contrasted to the way in which society receives that naming and shaming, which means that only an effective naming and shaming of true calling out of a person's real microaggressions only create the actual naming and shaming. What I mean is that naming and shaming will only be more popular the moment in which they actually call out people who actually do microaggressions. So that means it's not easy to just misuse this culture of naming and shaming and call out every single person who they say have microaggression, right? People had to relate to that, to want to name and shame an individual to a point in which you attribute fault to the person. That's quite a high threshold and a high standard. Given that the society we live in are privileged individuals, so we think it's also a high standard to begin with. No, thank you. So Jay talked about a couple of persons that we think largely got ignored in this debate, right? She talked about the person affected by microaggression, the person that need to feel empowered by the fact that they shouldn't have to tolerate those microaggressions and can call out those instances. So imagine a woman who has to go through it every day, having her boss say, "Oh, how cute," after you give a presentation on a really, really brilliant issue. So those people are not necessarily empowered to call out those microaggressions because of the difference in the power play between her and her bosses, or the fact that the boardroom was perhaps full of men. So this becomes really hard. But the culture of naming and shaming empowers her because she could ride behind the shame that those people are likely to feel from the expression of those expression of those naming and shaming. No, thank you. That this means that this affects the way in which this person who commits a microaggression feels as well. Will this restrict the privilege from being able to speak freely about the way in which they talk? Absolutely, and we think that's a great thing, right? So yes, the privilege might before they make a sexual joke that they think is funny and harmless, might have to think twice and might have to always consider whether or not they're harming another person. We think that's great. We're very happy for this world to be devoid of more funny sexual jokes, as opposed to women feeling hurt by the fact that those jokes are highly sexual and not at all funny to them, but they're forced to laugh along those men who make those jokes, right? We think we prefer that world in which people feel restricted and feel like they have to check their privilege and think about whether or not they hurt another person at every point in time. No, thank you. But we also talk about what was really important that they didn't want to deal with, right? Two very important stakeholders. Firstly, the power structures that exist in which microaggressions are continuously used to oppress certain minorities, for example, gender minorities like women, as well as people from racial minorities. So structures like the parliament that actively uses microaggression to shut out, for example, a woman who's giving a speech or things like that. The only way you can call out someone that in that level is to allow this culture of naming and shaming. We think it's very important because if at a high level, where at the parliament people are able to use microaggression, yet society don't have a culture of naming and shaming parliament members for committing microaggressions, we think it's highly problematic, right? Those people can run behind this entitlement of, but it's scientific data that women have periods or something, and that women are just less effective than men. And society don't feel any fault or don't feel like he should feel shame by those the things that he's saying in a minute. No time, sit down first. So we also think this seeps into pop culture. We think the culture of naming and shaming particularly affects pop culture, right? That a lot more. I'll take opening in 2 seconds or something. So restricts pop culture, allows pop culture to check the way in which they do commit microaggressions as well. Go ahead.
How do you think the victims feel when the aggressor becomes overly defensive as a result of their antagonism?
What overly defensive, right? So in a world in which you have a 5-minute conversation with a person, you don't think that person will be overly defensive. So if only in our world where you attribute fault and shame, then that person will be likely to be less defensive because they realize there's a societal anger towards their action of microaggression. How do you truly empower that victim, and how do you disempower the person who feel entitled to the fact that they could commit all those microaggressions? I don't think they truly understand the dynamic between individuals as well as the victims of microaggression to be able to win this debate, right? We think at the end of this debate, only on our side are we actually able to reverse the power structures that exist between victims of microaggressions and the perpetrators of those microaggressions. Only on our side, we have a culture of actively trying to identify those microaggressions, and only under our side, we can call out power structures that actively hurt minorities, as well as change the way in which pop culture works. We're proud to oppose.
Position that marks the conclusion of the opening half of this debate. I now call upon the member of government to begin the closing half.
You can never change racism through more hate, through naming and shaming individuals, through getting them defensive and making them feel like injustices were perpetuated against them. We think we would prefer a world with far more compassion. And while I agree with you and with a lot of what all said about microaggressions being bad, we will show you why you actually make microaggressions far worse. And not only that, you perpetuate brand new stereotypes and make it far more difficult for individuals to be, like, you perpetuate racism under your debate. All right, let's look at 2 questions in today's debate. Number 1, what kind of discourse occurs and how do we think you don't change it? But secondly, how do we think it increases the racism and hate towards those minorities to begin with? So the first thing you have to understand here is that the people who commit microaggressions on their side are necessarily doing it out of ignorance, right? So a person who catcalls isn't doing it because he thinks women are worse than men. They're necessarily doing it because they, like, if you ask any person who catcalls, they're saying that woman, I think that woman is pretty. But they don't understand the nuances behind it to begin with, right? They don't understand, sit down, that the nuance is that you are subjecting women to and making them feel uncomfortable to what you think. Sit down. When a woman clutches her handbag when a black man rides on a train, she also does not understand the nuance that causes discomfort towards those individuals. So what is my first extension and how does it deal with them? My first extension will be, why do we think that by creating this culture of naming and shaming, you destroy any attempt at that nuance and that attempt at moderation? So let's look at the first thing, right? Sit down. How do you shut down nuance? The first thing is that we think that naming and shaming drowns out a lot of the nuance, because understanding that a person's life has a limited amount of first interactions with these individuals. The quality of that interactions of those first interactions are incredibly important. Sit down. We think what this does is that it promotes an inertia of non-interaction. So we think that you get far lesser interactions because individuals now feel like whenever they want to have discourse between those victims, they just feel like they're going to get named and shamed. And that means you lose out on a lot of the nuance, because all of that nuance is drowned out by this naming and shaming culture that you're doing. You're losing the fact that these individuals don't realize that what they're doing is actually harmful towards these women. Sit down. But secondly, we think the quality of that interaction becomes substantially lower because those individuals feel like they can never be a part of that discourse. And here's what you have to understand here, right? The quality of discourse is the most important thing in changing what individuals, in changing that microaggression to begin with. Secondly, the ability to check privilege can not only be done through a culture of naming and shaming. And here's what they don't understand, right? They said the only way we can pop a liberal bubble is by naming and shaming. We think that's not true, right? Individuals can call out in a non-confrontational way. There are ways that individuals can do it without being malicious and explaining that nuance to begin with. So we don't think you necessarily need to shame individuals to pop that bubble. And the reason that's true is because when you analyze who these individuals are not malicious. They are ignorant, and that necessarily means, sit down, they are more likely to participate in those discussions, and that's why you don't need shame. It's because they're not evil, they're ignorant. The third thing to say here is, look, Jasmine had this entire spiel about people who are subjected to microaggressions and now they can ride on the wave. A few things to say here. That makes zero sense, because if the victim feels like the boss is already defensive due to the culture of naming and shaming, doesn't that mean that victim is less likely to call out the boss on things or victims for microaggressions to begin with because of that culture that exists? We think creating a culture of less defensiveness makes it more easier for those victims to call out. But the second thing is, like, just logical common sense, right? If your boss makes a mistake and you think your boss is going to be defensive, is it easier to be polite, or is it easier in that power play to say that, look, you're being disrespectful in a very non-confrontational manner? We think it's far easier to do it in a non-confrontational manner. But we think the third thing to say here is that it's extremely important that you empower individuals to do it in a non-confrontational manner. Because the more these individuals feel like the only way they can get through to people is by naming and shaming them, is the point where they'll be less likely to do it because they feel like they have to go against them in this us versus them mentality. Let's look at my second extension. Why do we think it increases racism and hate towards these minorities? So the culture of naming and shaming creates a new stereotype of minorities. What do we think this new stereotype is? We think it creates this stereotype that minorities are attempting to shut down discussion, that minorities are ultra sensitive, and that minorities are politically correct. We think that's why we have statements like women are feminazis, for example. They're not willing to listen to us. Do you get the irony here? The irony here is that by attempting to shut down microaggressions, which you don't do, you have in fact created a new stereotype towards a lot of minorities that they're not willing to partake in discourse. And that's extremely important, because that necessarily means it, number one, trivializes the kind of microaggression that these individuals face through, because the perception now is that minorities are only going through, like, minorities are ultra sensitive, right? Those microaggressions are not real. Like, the woman is just clutching her handbag. And that's why we think that stereotype is extremely harmful. But the second thing is that, sit down, it empowers the rhetoric of individuals who do commit those microaggressions to begin with. So they justify that it's okay for us to do these kind of microaggressions, because it's not that we're doing wrong things, it's that those minorities are ultra PC or are ultra sensitive to begin with. And that's why we think it's extremely important that you make sure that that you empower that kind of rhetoric to begin with. Sit down. But the third thing we think it does is that traps a lot of minorities in cycles of hate, right? The same way a black person is demonized for going against or for like attempting to say that, look, not all white people are evil, is the same thing that you do here. And those like minority or those majorities who attempt to reach out to those other majority friends who want to try and explain the nuance that exists within status quo, it's extremely difficult for them to do that, right? So you lose out on a lot of discourse that happens. And understand, right? This is the most important kind of discourse because it's the discourse that's most likely to change individuals' minds. But the last thing is that because individuals are less likely to cooperate as a whole, it means that less individuals are likely to take part in those discussions. And the justification of the individuals that have the rhetoric is that these people will never change. You have to understand that you cannot destroy stereotypes by creating more stereotypes. Not only do you create more stereotypes, this is the worst kind of stereotype that you can create. That minorities are simply attempting to shut down discourse, that minorities problems are not real, and that minorities do have microaggression. We think we need more love.
We now invite the network officers.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the culture of naming and shaming by adults will make them assess their interaction in their daily life. But it's a culture that adults practice and also disseminate towards their younger generation. It also affects how your parenting works, and that's translated into how children then will interact in things such as school. While side-opening government explained the benefits of naming and shaming and how it translates to pop culture, we're going to be the first team who will tell you how it will affect how children interact in school and how it is harmful for things such as bullying and all those sort of things. So before I move on to my substantives, let's just engage with the nonsense coming from side-opposing government. Firstly, their extension was, oh, because we want to shut down nuances, and you, under our side, how you destroy the attempt towards moderation. Look, firstly, they need to prove to us how these nuances are even good in the first place when that very nuances are actually stemmed from like malicious behavior, malicious intent, for instance. So we think that under our side of the house, moderation is much more likely at that point where you create a shock value and tell individuals that, hey, this is something that is wrong. Because under their side of the house, they told us, oh, you can call in a less confrontational manner. But see, at that point where you create a lot less confrontational manner, your privileged individuals will only treat this as a normal discussion as opposed to something that you need to take full responsible of, something that is much more that is important for you to highlight. Because under their side of the house, you don't realize how important those issues are in status quo. You don't realize how that issues actually affect the daily life of individual and how it is translated into their daily life. Therefore, we don't, under our side of the house, we think that the moderation is much more likely at that point where people can assess the discussion. No, thank you. This will also translate more engagement on their second extension, which is how under our side of the house, you will suddenly increase racism and hate, right? Firstly, they never tell us how this actually happened, but we think it is more likely under your side of the house because they told you that under our side of the house, at that point where you antagonize, name and shame people, you will be labeled as ultra-sensitive. Now people don't want to engage with you. Under your side of the house, it means that the privileged individuals under your side of the house is triggered because you are hurt by other people who were hurt by your statement, and suddenly you are also hurt because I hurt that individual. So under your side of the house, you are the privileged individuals that never check your privilege. And we think that under our side of the house, at that point where you create a shock value towards those white supremacists that, hey, this is something that is wrong, you will moderate your tone in how you engage towards these minorities, towards the black individuals, towards the Muslims on the ground. More on my substantives, no thank you. Firstly, how under our side, the stance coming from side-opposing government is simple. We believe that by naming and shaming individuals will change how children react towards things such as parenting and also how they interact within their friends in school, right? No thank you.
So we think that under your side of the house, there will be an entrenchment towards how children will interact with their friends, children and adolescents. Why? Why is it true? Because microaggression is something that is practiced, and when it is, it impacts. It is a subtle behavior that people will adapt through time, be it with parents or even if your school and if everyone is practicing it. You will create a stigma towards a particular group of individual or children, minorities within your school. No, thank you. How is this true? Because in your formative years, you will tend to adapt whatever you get around you. So when it is normalized within society that, oh, your parents do it, oh, my friends also do it, my teachers also do it, it means that it is a culture that you constantly will adapt into your life. And even if they do it subconsciously, this is the kind of culture that you entrench, and it will have a lasting effect towards the minorities on the ground. No, thank you. This will translate into their daily life. For instance, that if you're in class and if you are a black person who is smart, and people will say that, oh, you're a black person, you're not lazy, you're actually smart. Those are the kind of stigma that you entrench under your side of the house. That, oh, you're Asian, you're actually fun. Those are the stigma that you entrench under your side of the house. But at least under our side of the house, we could tell individuals and tell children that there are spectrum within individuals, that they need to be divorced with the identity that you generalize under your side of the house. Before that, defend yourself.
So if a 10-year-old commits a microaggression, how is the child not supposed to, number one, cry, and secondly, be receptive to the offense he caused when you openly antagonize him and his identity by naming and shaming him?
Okay, no. Because this, probably that will also happen in your school, but also this microaggression stems from the parents that constantly adapt those kind of behavior. These, for instance, teachers who adapt those kind of behavior. We think that by naming or shaming in schools, for instance, children are more receptive as opposed to adults, because it happens within their friends. They are less sensitive as opposed to adults, ladies and gentlemen. But what happens when this is practiced in the daily life? So this is where the comparative comes from. We think that at least under our side of the house, individuals will check each other and reassess the conversation and the language and how they participate in that discussion, and you will reassess how you want to engage with your friends. Under our side of the house, you create an environment where people want to learn better, because it's a safe space where you then want to constantly interact with your friends. We think that safe space in school means less bullying that's currently perpetuating much more rampantly in America. For instance, under your side of the house, when microaggressions is carried out in their daily life without naming or shaming individuals, children will carry out these narratives in their daily life, constantly bullying the minorities under your side of the house, the black individuals, not wanting to be friends with the particular individuals, or Muslims because you're scared that your friend is a terrorist. That is the stigma that you entrench under your side of the house. And those are the microaggressions that you constantly inflict to those very individuals. And our side of the house, we think that there are less discriminatory actions, but also we think that you create a safe space that is much more better. Therefore, the racism and hate that you entrench, that this say will be entrenched on the outside of the house, is unlikely, because we break that narrative of how people engage with each other. That, hey, each different individual, there are a spectrum of individuals, and each individual should be divorced from the identity that people attach onto those particular group of individuals. Therefore, it is much more likely for individuals from their formative years to grow up in an environment where they can treat each other better. We think it's more likely when microaggressions are being named and shamed. With that, we oppose.
House thanks the member of opposition, and now was the final speaker from Dub Bench, Government Whip.
So this is a wrong door. It's a wrong door.
Oh my god!
I'm so happy that I like it.
What is your motion? What is your motion? Everyone, okay, share the blame. Oh, Alfred, No. Oh, sorry. Oh, wow, studying appeared. Is it on? It's on.
Unless they're
Once again, the House invites government.
Almost every night, me, Amira, and all the other girls of the IIUM English Debate Club take to Facebook to name and shame the myriads of disgusting comments that are misogynistic, that perpetuate microaggressions on the university's Facebook page. Initially, though, we thought we were going to make changes, right? But slowly, these people started getting defensive. Sister, I am just advising you, right? Sister, But slowly, the conversation turned into them calling us crazy liberals who don't understand what they're trying to teach us. We think we have made zero progress in trying to tell them the nuances of what victim blaming means, the nuances of what choice means, and we think microaggression has made them only more defensive and reclusive to the kind of things that we're trying to teach them. But when I talk about in my speech, number one, I'll clarify what this culture looks like and how it actually hurts the kind of disempowered individuals that opening opposition wants to strengthen. Secondly, how exactly does it hurt discourse, and I'll bring back how in the long run we think we're going to get better change, bringing back our extensions. But before that, quickly dealing with closing opposition's extension, which we think basically were neutral statements telling us why microaggression is bad, which we agree. But there are benefits of having a society in which children grow up seeing their parents learn how these things are bad. Is contingent on them proving how these parents will change their mind, which we don't think they've done. But secondly, we agree that children need to learn. But the method in which you teach kids isn't a punitive way in which you tell them that what you did is wrong, your parents are racist, you should be ashamed. We think it's a perfect opportunity for us to raise adults who understand the nuance of diversity in society. If we educate them and tell them the reasonings as to why microaggressions are wrong, we think that can only take place without the act of shaming little children who are going to cry if you do those things. Therefore, we think that's
all about their extension. So first of all, what does the culture look like and how do we think it disempowers people? Number one, we think not only for their benefits to occur, it has to be as aggressive as possible. But secondly, we think because of the fact that some people within these movements take an active measure to do this name and shaming, it creates a pressure on individuals within these minorities who don't think they're in a position to name and shame. So for example, you make that woman in the boardroom a social battering ram if you expect her to name and shame her boss who decides whether she gets promoted, who decides whether she gets a learning opportunity in her career. Oftentimes, individuals within these minority groups who choose not to name and shame are branded as traitors because you are a sellout to your job, you're a sellout to the patriarchy, and you don't want to name and shame. Whereas these are individuals who choose to be strategic in the way they want to teach individuals about the hurtful nature of microaggressions. Therefore, we don't think you create any equalizing playing force in the power dynamics of these societies. You actually make it more difficult for these individuals to opt out of this strategy because their minority community creates a pressure on them to be as aggressive as possible, because naming and shaming is the trending thing to do. Naming and shaming is what's going to get you the most retweets, and it's going to be more effective. But the second question then becomes, why do we think discourse is better under our side? Sit down. Number one, like I raised in a POI and Jay agreed, you can't, when you name and shame, you cannot assess the intention of a person and then name and shame that person. It inherently means you paint a brush whether that person intended it to be hurtful or not. This often means when you tell a person, when you shame a person, when you embarrass the person that their remark is racist, that their privilege blinds them of the realities of the world, you often force them to a corner where they're forced to defend themselves. I use the same characterization that opening opposition somehow expected the same white privileged members of parliament under your side to somehow, when you name and shame them, when you call them racist and their image means everything to them, somehow they're going to be like, oh yes, I'm a racist, enlighten me, woman, and teach me. Oftentimes, they're going to do everything in their power to defend themselves and say, you are overreacting, you are the drama queen, you are the feminazi. Oftentimes, because of the same people who are in the position of power, the more you shame them, the less they defend the nuances of why they act that way, the more they're trying to defend their image. You think you make the nuanced conversation or the actually trying to find out their intentions and solving that even more difficult. Therefore, what do we think happens better under our side? We think when you actually discuss their person, did you realize that you called me that and that's very hurtful? Did you realize that the word that you use for our community is a derogatory and it has cultural baggage or historical baggage that is very hurtful to my community? When you approach individuals in a manner where you don't directly, instantly blame them for the hurt they caused you, human psyche learns better or understands these situations better when you don't at first instance attack them and thinks it's directly their fault. We think those kind of changes with these bigoted individuals can only be made when that approach is taken sit down. But how does this also damage nuance further on? We think a lot of the times individuals who are on the fence, who may not be racist, who may not make microaggressions intentionally, but want to ask questions, the moment they see your community as a community that continuously name and shames people, they find it very difficult to ask you questions regarding stereotypes that they hold, because they feel if they make a mistake, they might be branded as a racist. This means those sex jokes or those disgusting jokes are not going to go away. They're just going to go to their own group of boys who are going to continue perpetuate those jokes, but never obliterate them. Yes.
So all minorities are already called drama queens and being oversensitive through the introduction of the idea of microaggression. How do you allow them to feel that they deserve to feel all the outrage that they feel right now?
Because I've proven to you that when you continuously tell them that you are wrong, that you are embarrassing, that you're a racist, that you are a man who doesn't think women deserve these rights, you continue to push them to defend those things, whereas if it's the same kind of privileged people you talk about, they do not want to admit that they are racist. They do not want to admit that if it's the same characterization that you want to run. But what we talk about in our extension, we think you create a further and more harmful stereotypes that's going to prevent these individuals in integrating in the long run. These are individuals that are called sensitive, individuals that are called difficult to talk to. This is the same ammunition that you give to racist people, because now they can say, the reason why I do not think that this community I don't want to engage in this discourse with that community is they are so sensitive, is that whenever I try to talk to them, they call me privileged and that I don't understand the plight of their community. In the long run, we make it even more difficult for us to force these racist individuals and these hurtful people to change their ways, because they can always use this new stereotype
stereotype of this community being ultra sensitive and ultra political correct to never talk to you. We think at the end of the day, we think it's better for us to approach this more strategically to ensure that in the long run, these communities are able to understand their nuances. Because we think shaming a person and making a person educated on the nuances of what they make you feel are mutually exclusive, and we think we should go to the side which teaches nuances. Thank you.
House thanks the government whip and joined by the final speaker, opposition whip.
Just because Jon Snow doesn't know anything does not mean he doesn't play a role in the whole story. We believe just because you're ignorant does not mean you have a free pass to do every single thing that you wish, insensitive to the other people surrounding you. It's a shame that the only response that we get from our side is that, oh, you can educate these children into having better behavior. Well, Mahirah already told you, this is the fact that in their own home, the fact that the parents do not realize their own microaggression, pass down that kind of social interaction to other people and kind of discriminatory action and stereotypical idea of other communities and other situations towards their children causes that situation. How is this different from their education if they want that distinction? One, you can directly tell them their education, this is wrong. But when they are constantly exposed to things that they see through their parents or things they see from their own brothers and sisters or how they treat other people in society, those are the things that they will adopt as well. Constant exposure will triumph the kind of short-term education that they face in school. They need to understand the fact that all of these parents can pass down that kind of stereotypical behavior is harmful in the first place. Also engaging to the fact what OG want to talk about, saying that this interaction does not affect the society at large. When we told you from the start, those things that your unintentional interaction can also be passed down and can also have a trickle-down effect towards other parts of society. Let's go with what they wanted to talk about right now. They believe that love will triumph if you just don't actually talk about, if you approach these people silently. Let's point out firstly, as much as they want to say that we don't actually say how people being reclusive, that they will suddenly say, oh, sister, I'm more aware and then you need to teach me and enlighten me. Under their side, they also didn't tell us how love can make sure these people also come out and say that, oh, sister, I'm more aware, I need to be teach, you need to teach and be enlighten me. But at least under our side, these people become reclusive. They also contemplate on their action when people, a lot of society say that their action is wrong. They become defensive and they also need to defend their own stereotypical action and their stereotypical meaning in the first place. And they cannot run away with just saying, chill bro, it's just a prank, it's just a joke, this is for fun. It doesn't work that way. You need to realize the action that you take also has consequences towards other people in society. I'll engage two things right now. First, the kind of discourse they will achieve under their side of the house, and secondly, how does it affect towards society at large. Let's look at the alternative that they wanted in the first place. When you talked about people actually like calling out or being less confrontational in the first place, Mahirah already told you that the fact that now normal discussion will also mean that they don't really care in the first place. But secondly, just because in this situation, under the best situation that under their side that they say is a problem on our side, is that really think about it. The fact that after you offend a feminist and then they want to defend themselves, you victimly blame them for being offensive right after you offend them. We don't think that is the best action because you're the one that is propagating that hate and they're propagating that hate speech in the first place. You cannot go and victim blaming. They are the one wrong in the first place when they want to defend their own right. We don't think that's the action that you want to talk about. But lastly, you need to understand also why do they actually want to like offend all these people and stuff like that. The thing is, they are never aware of the action that they taken in the first place. And if you take a soft stance approach in that side, the awareness will never come because they constantly think that this action is not a problem. Me interacting this and me using racism or stereotypical reference as a joke is not a problem. That's when they can continue use that thing as a joke, as a reference, without thinking there's nothing wrong in the first place. Only when you directly engage them and make them aware will they think that this is a problem and that action needs to be taken. At least on the outside, they will be reclusive and not do that any single way. So less first interaction under their side that people double think about the kind of things that they say is good because at least when they don't actually have that first interaction of becoming a racist or a bigot, it's better for society to engage better in the first place. Closing.
You haven't proven to us how this short, bitter interaction will result in them going back and educating themselves oftentimes they're going to go back to their majority and continue to talk about the same stereotypes that they're hold because they're not educated on the nuances.
Yeah, but you never told us, like I just told you guys, it's not mutually exclusive. You never told us the other outcome anyway in the first place. But even under your side, it doesn't necessarily prove that because they're suddenly like, they are not being attacked or directly, they can still go back and talk this about with their friend and enforce that stereotype anyway. At least under our side, they still reclusive and they don't do that racist remark to the person that's particularly involved. They don't make that racist remark to girls or to the minority because they know those people don't like that racist remark and they only keep it to their own social circle. Let's talk about what OG want to talk about in the first place. Sit down. I'll take you after I dash you. Now let's talk about what OG want to talk right now. First thing, they want a bit of things that they want to talk, which is similar, is that this discourse doesn't relate to how society reacts in the first place. We say firstly, that's wrong. Because like it or not, when it comes to the situation that happens, just because you're ignorant to the society around you does not mean it doesn't affect to how you interact with other people as well. But let's take them down their best case scenario, whereby it's only a personal and social interaction between one person and another person. But it still reflects how you treat Indians in a particular context when you think of them as that Mamat waiter in that store, or how you treat women in the particular instances. That also reflects how you would see other women as well. But you only focus on that particular interaction. We say there is also a reflection of your own stereotypical or bigoted belief under your side. That's why you make that interaction and that's why you make that situation. Even though it's on a personal level and that person might not be offended, it reflects the kind of belief that you have under your side, subconsciously or consciously at the end of the day. So it also trickle down to other situations, like how we told you, because it can affect children, it can also trickle down to people who learn it subconsciously through you in the first place. Yes.
Respond to Reuben's argument about how aggression and control towards privileged people in society prevents them from responding because the offended are branded as racist and assumed to be never able to understand the offense that they cause to a minority.
See, I told you, the fact that you make them, you as a perpetrator, say that they are victim blaming is particularly wrong in the first place as well. Under your side, the discourse won't happen anyway. Why? The interaction of discourse under your side is to the fact that it only happens when the perpetrators suddenly feel enlightened that they want to go out and they want to have that interaction. We told you, if they're never aware of the things that wrongdoing that they have in the first place, they never want to engage in that particular discourse. And they, every time you say anything, they will constantly shut them out and just say, okay, that's fine, I will not do it again. They will never realize the problem that they have in society. But will actually, lastly, will it actually have a particular harm to how you perceive people in the long run? The root cause of the problem that they never want to talk about is that they agree that this also stems from radical ideas of bigoted or sexist or racist remarks. But they never want to engage to the fact that there are ways for you to change this and you need to make sure these people are aware that they are not doing it consciously. We say making a direct engagement and making a direct attack against them, make sure that they are more aware of the things that they say in public and make sure they are more inclusive and double think about what they want to say.
Shake hands. Thank you.